Okay, welcome back. So now we have set the stage for developmental research, and by talking about the goals of research and the criteria of research. So just kind of as the preliminary things to consider before we actually engage in research. Now we're going to actually talk about the methods used to collect data, and after we'll talk about actual research designs that are used. So the most widely used methods are listed here. So we have naturalistic observations. That's our first one. So this is boiled down very simply. We're watching them. We're watching children in their everyday lives and recording what happens, what they actually do or what they say. So some advantages of this method. Well, you're gathering objective natural information. There's no interference or discomfort of a more controlled, maybe experimental setting. And you're revealing the full complexity of their behavior in observing them. So what about disadvantages? People might behave differently when they're being watched. It's always a possibility, trying to put on a show. Also, expectations might shape the way things are observed. There might be bias or selective observation on the researcher's end, maybe unconscious bias. And this could impact the type of data that's being recorded, believe it or not. It's always a possibility that that factor of human error, right, or human bias. Also, technically, can't always write everything that you're seeing or that you're hearing, right? So information might be lost along the way if you can't keep up. And also it can be time consuming to analyze observational recordings and research. So those are some advantages, disadvantages. Next, we have experiments. Boiled down very simply, we're testing them. So we are introducing a change and measuring the effects of the change. So we're really studying cause and effect relationships, looking at patterns and correlations. So we're looking at how does changing one factor cause a change in another factor. In experiments, we will randomly assign participants, usually to at least two groups, the experimental group and the control group. The experimental group would be they are exposed to the treatment condition, whatever we're trying to test for, whatever our research question is. And the control group would be the group that is not exposed to the treatment condition. And after, you're comparing the groups to determine if the treatment condition actually made a difference. And then from there, doing your conclusions. So experiments are ultimately designed to test a hypothesis and a research question. So it's much more controlled and formal than a naturalistic observation. Some advantages, it's the best method to test cause and effect relationships. It's what it's designed to do, right? But some disadvantages is that people behave differently in experimental settings, can make them feel a little tense, unnatural, maybe nervous. They might put on a show in what they're saying or doing because they know that, you know, this is going to be recorded and put out there for research, although it'll be anonymous, but still. So can cause, you know, a difference in how people behave, and that can distort the validity of the results. So much less natural than, this is literally called naturalistic observations. Experiments are much more, I don't want to say forced, but kind of, right? Everything's very formal and there's a procedure that you're going through. Lastly, we have clinical interviews. So these are asking questions tailored to the individual, just talking to them, talking to the child. So some advantages is you can follow a child's way of thinking and uncover patterns in their thinking. So that's a big benefit of this method. Piaget actually relied heavily on child interviews in his research. Some disadvantages, there is a heavy reliance on verbal expression in interviews, of course, and this could be inappropriate for very young children, right? Young children who are still developing their language skills and how they communicate with others. It could skew results, right? They might actually be more capable than we think. They just can't verbally express it yet. So that could be a limitation in this kind of research and this kind of data collection. Also, how things are phrased in an interview can influence a child's response. So we have to be very careful to keep things open-ended and avoid any biased phrasing, especially with children who are very susceptible to those kinds of things. So that's an overview of the methods of how we can collect data. And triangulation is just two or more methods combined. I just put that there so you know. Sometimes these will be combined in research. Now, what about research designs? So now that we have created a goal and selected a method of data collection, what about the overall plan? Who will be included in the study? How and when will data be gathered? And how will it be analyzed? So this is research design. So there's 4 basic designs. We're accounting for the passage of time in different ways. So we have a longitudinal design. Some of us might have heard of this before. And we're following the same group of participants over time. Could be 6 months, could be 30 years. The image here looks like following the same individual for almost a lifespan, right? So that's definitely longitudinal study. Some advantages is we're examining the development and discovering patterns over time in the same individual. Disadvantages is it tends to be more expensive, definitely a more long-term commitment than other types, and this could lead to participants dropping out. And also, we might confuse age differences with cohort differences. So a cohort is people born around the same time. You can almost think of it like a generation. So they're going to share generational experiences that will differ from those born earlier or born later. So I'm just trying to explain what a cohort difference is. So for example, studying children's fears from birth and on, if that was the goal of a study, let's say. So if we set the context, if a child is living during the Great Depression in their early years, flashing back to almost 100 years ago, let's say their young years are during the Great Depression, and then as they get, older, around, pre-adolescence, World War II is happening, they might lose a parent in World War II or be sent away from parents for safety. So if we were using these children in a study on fears, the findings might show that these children fear hunger in their early years, and then around age 9 or 10, they begin fearing losing their parents. Does this mean that all children fear hunger in their early years and fear losing their parents around age 9? No, right? This is specific to this cohort and what they experienced in this historical era that they grew up in. So it'd be impossible to determine whether this reflects general laws of development of all children, or was it a result of this particular cohort's experiences in this historical era. So that's a cohort effect, and something that could be a limitation in longitudinal designs. We also have cross-sectional designs. So this is collecting information about groups of various ages at one point in time. So kind of the opposite of a longitudinal design. So it's the most widely used method to study development. For example, studying a 4-year-old, a 10-year-old, 20-year-old, and a 60-year-old at the same time. They're different people, but you're getting snapshots of those different age groups and making inferences, making your own conclusions based on that. So you're comparing the results of groups and making inferences about developmental changes that occurred, whatever you're trying to study. So like I said, you're kind of getting little snapshots of different age groups at the same time, rather than following the same person over a long period of time. So it's a lot quicker. That's an advantage. You can gather all your research in one go if you really want to. Less expensive, like I said, less time consuming. But disadvantages is you are getting these kind of disconnected snapshots. You're not looking at the same person over time. You're looking at different people. And as we have said previously, everyone is unique, has their own context that they grew up in and whatnot. So you're kind of relying on making inferences rather than conclusive data things that you actually observed in the same individual. So getting little snapshots. Now we have cohort sequential design. So this is actually combining longitudinal and cross-sectional designs. So you're studying several cohorts over time. It's kind of depicted in this graph here. So at the bottom, we have the year 2000, 2005, 2010, and so on. So as you can see at each point in time, we are studying, different individuals, but we're also following one individual over time and kind of following things over time. So it's combining both of these research designs, longitudinal and cross-sectional. Advantages is age-related factors are separated from cohort factors, but disadvantages is kind of the same disadvantages as longitudinal and cross-sectional designs, right? But maybe to a lesser extent. You're kind of getting the best of both worlds in this way, but you're also going to have some of the same disadvantages too. So lastly, we have microgenetic design. So this is focusing on development over short periods, sometimes only a few hours or days. And this design is usually just for when children are on the threshold of a change. So for example, being able to use a new addition strategy. As we know, children are developing rapidly, and this also applies to their cognition and how they process information, and it could translate into how they approach math. So for new addition strategies, it could change over time. They're constantly grappling with what strategies are the most efficient for them. It's kind of like this chart here. So we have the passage of time at the bottom, and then on this axis, we have percentage used, and we have 4 strategies. So this is a very watered down chart with not a lot of detail, but it's a good example of how children might use different strategies more frequently at different points in time, right? They're experimenting with what works for them and what seems most efficient. So this would be a good thing to study for microgenetic design, how children use new adding strategies. So how they switch from starting at 1 and counting all the way up to 6. And then they advance to calculating 6 plus 2 by counting up from 6. So they're getting more efficient in their strategies. So advantages provides a record of change as it's occurring. You're actually seeing things, seeing these changes in how they do things in real time, which is really cool. And you're revealing processes that contributed to this change. But disadvantages is you're limited to the changes occurring over short periods of time. So that is a big limitation of this type of research. It's really reserved for specific things to study, specifically when children are on the threshold of a change. So that was pretty dense, I know, but that concludes research designs. And lastly, we're just going to look at correlation versus causation, and then ethics in research, and then we're done for the day. So thank you for joining, everyone, and I will see you in the next video.